Right. Well, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Patience and to Dominic, and off we go. Dominic, I'm asking you.
Thank you, Chris. I am unmuted. There we are.
Good.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to this discussion evening with Patience Wheatcroft, who is standing for the chairmanship of the European Movement as chair. I'm going to host this evening. So what I intend to do is to say a few words first, then to have some conversation with Patience. And then when we've had that conversation, which I hope will cover some of the topics which will be of interest to you, to then open it up to the meeting, and we will take your questions and we will endeavour to try to make sure that all of you who have questions are able to put them to Patience either directly, in which case you will be unmuted to do that, or alternatively, if you want to put them through the chair, then I will deal with it and make sure that they are put to Patience. We may bunch questions if there are questions of a similar type, but I hope that at least in the course of the time that's going to follow, you will have your questions satisfactorily answered and will feel that you're able to put them to her. Can I just start by saying how delighted I was to be asked to host this evening. Patience Wheatcroft is a very old friend, and I have to say, they always say a friend in need is a friend indeed. And as far as I'm concerned, although we've known each other a long time, that friendship rather blossomed and deepened when I was facing considerable difficulties in those last 2 years in Parliament, that period from 2017 to 2019, when I was struggling along with colleagues to try and get a second referendum and gradually acquiring pariah status within my own political party as a consequence. With the consequence, of course, that in September 19, I was chucked out by Boris Johnson, which I now regard as a considerable accolade and feel rather pleased about, in the sense that it removed a decision which I would otherwise have had to take about leaving, but as he took it away for me, that solved that problem. And throughout all that, Patience was steadfast in her support, and as many of you will know, it was only a month or two, about 6 weeks later, I think, that she herself took the decision to give up the Conservative whip in the House of Lords and to sit as a crossbencher, an independent crossbencher. Now, Patience has a long and very distinguished track record in journalism, particularly in economic journalism, having been deputy city editor of the Mail on Sunday, then the business and city editor of the Times in 1997, and then the editor of the Sunday Telegraph in 2006. And in that period, winning prizes as the London Press Club, the Business Journalist of the Year, and then moving and using that career and her skills, firstly into politics, having been made a member of the House of Lords, and then also in a whole series of other functions as a non-executive director of a number of organisations, a trustee of the British Museum. So this is somebody with a great deal of background experience on the subject which actually lies at the root of the debate which we've been having on Europe, which is about the beneficial impact that European Union membership can have on our economic and wider well-being, which is at the centre of why we're meeting this evening. And we are meeting at what appears to be a pretty critical time, because quite apart from the fact that Brexit has manifestly failed, we are just beginning perhaps to see, and I'm going to, my first question to Patience is going to be how she sees the current situation for those of us who continue to believe that the closest possible relationship with our European partners is really important to our national well-being and future. So I wondered if that might be a good starting point, Patience, to ask you for your views as to how you see the current situation.
Well, thank you, Dominic, and thank you for that introduction. I've been sitting here blushing, a bit like hearing one's own obituary in advance. So thank you for the flattery. It It is a pivotal time, though, isn't it? It does feel as if after a pretty bruising period, the country is waking up to just what damage the version of Brexit that we've got is inflicting. That doesn't mean that everybody is absolutely right for rejoining, but I think there is, and the opinion polls show it, a recognition that it was a mistake to do it the way we did, that it isn't working, and therefore we have to find solutions. That's a great starting point for the European movement and for those of us who believe that we have to get much closer to the EU. And I think in the end, what's going to drive this fairly quickly is the economy, because it's absolutely clear that the economy needs a quick fix. And there are very few options open to a government to find that quick fix. The obvious one to me is to get back into the single market as quickly as possible. And I think, having heard what Rishi Sunak had to say last week over the Northern Ireland situation, none of us, however deeply we are pro-EU, could have made the case for the single market more effusively than he did. It was remarkable. So I think the whole mood is turning that whoever wins the next election, but it's hard not to believe in the Labour Party, and with an overall majority, they will need to do something about the economy fast. And getting back into the single market is just about the only option I can see. So I'm increasingly optimistic on that front. And of course, it then becomes much easier to build all sorts of bridges with the EU. The only obstacle will be freedom of movement. I think on that front too, people are beginning to wake up to the fact that freedom of movement works both ways. Pro-EU people have been incredibly bad about countering the argument that free movement just means they all come over here and we lose our jobs and it's disastrous. Actually, freedom of movement was wonderful for Brits. They could go and live abroad, work abroad, love and settle abroad on the continent if they wanted to. Broad experiences. They could simply go and enjoy the sunshine for long periods if that's what they want, and benefit from having a lot of young, energetic Europeans coming and working here. So I think we've just got to make our case better than we did before. And if we do, I'm optimistic that within my lifetime, we'll get back into the EU.
Thank you very much. Can we then move on? Because we have this movement, an extraordinary movement, really, movement which used to have huge thousands, tens of thousands of members. Then after we went into the EEC, started to shrink. And then, of course, since 2016 and the shock of actually leaving, has revived and returned to being potentially a mass movement. And certainly, as I know, from the extraordinary good fortune I had when I stood as an independent in 2019, I'm sorry I didn't succeed, but lots and lots of people pouring out and pouring down, not just from London actually, to come and help me on the campaign. So we could go out and do 250 people on a leafleting evening, which was really quite extraordinary. I'd never seen politics quite conducted that way. So we got this movement and we need to do something with it. And perhaps the first and most obvious question, seeing you're seeking to be chair, is what do you think you can bring to the role of being chair of the EM and to taking it forward?
First and foremost, the EM needs to increase its profile. People like you have been involved with it for a long time. But as you pointed out, Dominic, 17,500 members is nowhere near enough. As I've been saying on the hustings, even the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds has 1.25 million nearly. So given the strength of feeling there is in this country about Europe, 17,500 is pretty poor. And think in part it's because the European movement has taken the view, and I had this conversation with a former chairman. I asked what the EM was campaigning on. And he said, no, you don't understand. We are a movement. We're not a campaigning organization. And that attitude has somehow been allowed to prevail. And although there have been street stalls and campaigns at local levels, the EM just hasn't managed to get its profile high enough to even be noticed, which is why the membership is actually so low. It needs to be much higher. The EM needs to be a strongly campaigning organization. But first of all, it needs to be recognized. And so my first priority was to make sure that the EM had a really loud voice and was heard. And I'm afraid no amount of social media makes up for having a presence in the mainstream media. And that's where, because of the strange career I've had, I think I'm pretty well placed to up the profile of the EM in mainstream media. And I do think that's important, because unless we can build the profile, we won't increase the membership. And unless we can increase the membership, we won't have the money to actually build the campaigning function. So we've got to start with members. And I would have a big drive immediately to bring in business members, because, well, you know, Dominic, because we both work really hard to try and get business to actually speak up about the fact that it did not want to leave the EU. But business was too cowardly. They didn't want to upset government. And now they really are suffering. And I think the time is right for recruiting business, both big businesses, but also, and probably much easier, the small and middle-sized businesses that are really suffering. And with business comes a bit more cash. The EM used to have business members, and I think we have to find a way of rebuilding that. And because I have quite strong links into business, I've been talking to people already and would have a group of people who are well known in business who would recruit their fellows in. And I think that's a big step. And it would begin to get the EM talked about a lot more. And then we need to work out exactly what campaigns we're going to go for and how we'll do it, and make the name of the EM synonymous with matters European, so that whenever anybody wants a quote on Europe, it wouldn't occur to them not to come to the EM. So we become a sort of speakers bureau with people all over the country, representing all sorts of different walks of life, young, old, doctors, dentists, you name it. And they will be able to speak locally about issues, because I'm a strong believer in the local media being a really good way to get your message out. And the EM is well placed to have a network of people across the country that could be called on, eloquent, articulate, with strong views on Europe, obviously. And they would be a really useful adjunct to what the centre can do. But if we could make that a central function with the EM, and I think we could do that really quite quickly, that whenever there was an issue, for instance, the Sunak deal on Northern Ireland, why on earth wasn't the EM view heard loudly then? It never occurred to the media to come to the EM and ask for a comment, but it should be a natural reaction. And I think we can make it so, and just raise the profile. And once we've done that, we then feed out to the grassroots. The grassroots are crucial. We've got to get the campaigns going locally, but you can't strengthen the local groups unless you've got the resources coming from the centre. So that would be my initial plan. So that's the first 3 days dealt with.
That's, well, we will certainly hit the ground running with that. Can I just turn to, I mean, the rather difficult subject? I mean, I'm aware of it from my own angle. When the EM was set up, this was a non-party political broad church movement. And of course, there were conservatives in it. Conservatives in many ways were some of the original founders of the European movement. Labour were a bit of the laggards in those days. And it was, although when Roy Jenkins was there, then of course things began to turn. Labour voted against our joining the EC, but they had all those rebels who actually took it over the line and supported Ted Heath when he had rebels in the Conservative Party. But we can't escape the fact that since 16, conservatism has been a bit in the doghouse when it comes to Europe. And those of us who were conservatives have tended to be pushed out, and those who are still pro-European conservatives, and they do exist, they're actually quite a large number, have tended to be silenced. And at the same time, perhaps very understandably, there are a lot of the grassroots who see the Conservatives and a Conservative government as the enemy. And even any of us who've been associated with being Conservatives as being similarly tainted. And I just wondered how you were going to approach that issue, because we're a non-party political organisation. In fact, I suggest that if we're to succeed, it's essential that we should be able to get support in all the main political parties, because otherwise rejoining, even going back into the single market, isn't going to happen. But how do we get over that? How will you get over that? Oh, this is just another Conservative member of the ex-Conservative member of the House of Lords. Wouldn't it be better to have somebody much more radical? And can we really trust her to wave the flag for us and for the European movement? Or is she just a sort of somebody who's rather peripheral, because that's not what the current movement feels it's about?
Dominic, you and I both know that the Conservative Party we joined is nothing like the Conservative Party that exists today. It's a great sadness. I feel quite embarrassed to have got a Conservative history, and it shouldn't be like that, because I signed up to join David Cameron when he was proclaiming that his ambition was to heal broken Britain. And it seemed to me then that that was a noble mission, and I was happy to go along and try and help with it, because Britain was definitely broken then. But of course, if it was broken then, it's far more broken now, which is very, very depressing. But the Conservative Party then was very different to today's Conservative Party. And I've been horrified, really, to see people who came into the Lords, many of them after me, but who had worked closely with David Cameron on remaining in Europe. Once they got into the Lords as Conservatives, they trooped through the lobby loyally with the government, following the whip and voting for all the government policies that were going to wreck their European dream. And not being a particularly tribal animal, I found that very depressing. I couldn't toe that line. Like you, I just voted against the government. And when they didn't sack me, eventually I had to go of my own accord. But I have found it very strange. And journalists tend not to be tribal. So the whip was a strange feeling for me anyhow, and I was a serial rebel. But I think that the Conservative Party, losing you, David Gauke, Anna Soubry, it's a huge loss. And you were the ones who were in line with former Tory thinking. You're absolutely right about the roots of the European movement. It was Duncan Sands who was the originator of it. And we shouldn't lose sight of thinking. Indeed, it was espoused by Churchill as to why the European movement was required and why the whole European ideal had to be pursued. And it wasn't about economics, it was about peace. And if ever we should remember that, with a war on in Europe now, it's a great reminder that sensible Europe holding together and being stronger together is where we should want to be and will want to be. So that's the conservative position, or my position as a former conservative. But you're absolutely right. The European movement only succeeds if it's totally non-party political. It has to be open to every party and people who are not interested in party politics at all. And unless it can succeed in that, it will not succeed in its overall aim. So I think it's a great sadness that the Conservative European Forum, which was part of the overall umbrella organisation, is no longer involved, in part because the EM did something overtly party political and encouraged people to vote against the Tories in some constituencies. And I think that's the sort of mistake that the EM has to completely avoid. We don't want to get involved in party politics at all. The EM has the unique position of being a single purpose organisation determined to get the UK back closer to the heart of Europe and eventually to rejoin. And I think it's that single mission which must colour everything we do. And of course, in pursuit of that single mission, it has to be completely non-party political. And I hope that I will manage to persuade people of that. My endorsements come from right across the board, every political party. And I think that demonstrates that I'm used to working cross-party. I am currently a cross-bencher, and I will always work cross-party because I can't think of a better way to work. But I'd be really interested to hear, Dominic, do you think that we can get the Conservative European Forum back within the EU tent? Because we need to get stronger together.
Yes, I do. I'm sure that it's possible because that's where the CF was very happy to be an affiliated organisation. But and the CEF, I should explain, is nowadays an organisation which is open to Conservative Party members who feel pro-European. I'm afraid it's also opened it, well, not afraid, I'm very glad that it's also opened itself to ex-Conservatives who haven't joined other political parties, but feel philosophically Conservative with a small c and pro-European, and we're therefore exiles. And so it fulfills that role under David Liddington's chairmanship. And David has been a very good chair. He is over from me. But you're right. We have to be able to include people. So if you're saying you're targeting Conservative seats, quite apart from the fact I think it's really in breach of the EM's constitution to say that, you may well be targeting people who are the very people who we want to bring on board. And my own view is that there are more Conservatives out there, including in Parliament, who would like to be supportive and much more supportive than they can be, because they're prevented from doing so effectively by concern that their associations will turn against them. And they're the people we need to encourage. Indeed, we need to encourage people in every political party, because that is what we are supposed to do. When it comes to endorsements, but I don't know, but the people listening may be interested. I mean, obviously I'm doing this because I'm endorsing you. I think you'd be a very good chair for the EM. I'm sure the others could also do it, but that's not the point. We have to come make choices. But are there other people who you also see as being important in terms of endorsing you and giving you their support?
Yes, I think it's what I've tried to do is encapsulate the breadth of reach that I hope I can have. So apart from the politicians, I have scientists backing me. Sir Paul Nurse, Nobel Prize winner, currently running the Crick Institute and doing fantastic work on cancer. And Paul has been very vocal about the damage that's being done to his institution and science generally through Brexit. Professor Roy Anderson, who is one of the experts on COVID, his specialty is infectious disease. He's at Imperial College, and I'm actually a trustee with him of a charitable organisation. So science, Julia Neuberger, whose experience of health is right across the board, of course, and she's currently running a health authority. Arts, Neil McGregor, who is the nation's darling, former director of the British Museum, the author of History of the World in 100 Objects, a voice that is now so familiar on the radio and absolutely wonderful and reassuring. Neil has given me an endorsement, which I'm very flattered by. But I worked with him at the British Museum, and it was one of the greatest pleasures. My chairman at the British Museum, Niall Fitzgerald, who's a businessman, Irish businessman, very Irish now. He's endorsed me. I should own up, he's a personal friend anyhow. So I'd have been very upset if he didn't. But Niall's been chairman of Unilever, chairman of Reuters. He's got huge influence in the business world and would be prevailed upon by me to bring that to bear were I to succeed. Quite a surprise, Michael Cashman. Michael, Labour peer, very, very strong LGBT campaigner. He's with me. So it's a real mix. And I'm delighted with that. I think that together, if I could pull them all into work for the EM, we'd have quite a team. And believe me, they would all have to work for the EM. Oh, Helena Kennedy, now there's somebody to reckon with as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, I'm conscious that it shows how time slips by. We've been talking for nearly half an hour, and it's time we brought in some of our audience who have questions for you. Now, the first one is from Paul Wilmer, who has asked that I should ask the question. And his question is this: in the hustings, all three candidates pledged to work together after the election. Mike Galsworthy said that if he was elected, he would ask you to chair a business forum. Would you accept that invitation? And if you are elected, how would you plan to work with Mike and Tom?
I'd certainly be interested to discuss it with Mike. Until we'd worked out exactly what it entailed, I wouldn't commit. And until I knew exactly what he as chair had planned for the EM, I think it would be foolish to commit. But obviously, Mike is keen on becoming chair, and I wish him well. But I'm in this actually to become chair. And then we can talk about it. But of course, I want what's best for the EM in the long run. Thank
you. Now, next one is from Sandra Kaduri. I don't know whether Sandra wanted to ask that herself or whether, in fact, I'm being asked to ask it for her, which makes it.
Yeah, hi, Dominic. I put a few.
Hello, Sandra. You can ask it yourself.
Well, I actually put a few questions in the chat, so I'm actually just going to go for my last question, if you don't mind.
That's all right.
Yeah, just one about the kind of the umbrella-ness of the European movement. I heard some EM staff horrified at the idea of waving flags again and things like that. And I found that a real shame, because if the EM is not going to embrace all shades of pro-European passion, then who will do that? So that was one thing, all the kind of different shades of pro-Europeanness. How will you embrace that? And also, how will you use the EM to heal the wounds, end divisiveness, and unite the country as a whole? Can you see a role for the EM in doing that?
I don't know who's suggesting that EM staff shouldn't wave flags. Certainly not me. I'm all in favour of flag waving, particularly if it's blue with the stars on. So we've got to keep waving the flag. Look what's behind Chris. And if people are working for the EM, they should feel really keen on waving the flag and be encouraged to. I don't think that stops them waving a Union Jack, should they so wish. At the moment, I have no wish to wave a Union Jack. That doesn't make me unpatriotic, but I fear it doesn't send the right message that I would like to send at the moment. But I've happily got a Ukrainian flag flying outside my house in Kent, blue and yellow, the right colours again. So on that point, Sandra, I hope I can put your mind at rest. What was the second part of your question?
How are you going to use the European movement to bring the country together after so much divisiveness?
That's a much harder thing to do, because this country undoubtedly is horribly divided at the moment, in so many ways, actually. And I think that the government is feeding that divisiveness because of pandering to the far right. And some of the rhetoric that comes out, for instance, over asylum seekers, is intentionally or non-intentionally deepening those divides. It's feeding the far right tendencies. It really is pandering to the lowest common denominator. And I fear it's not within the scope of the EM to do a great deal about that, which is a shame, because I'd like to be able to, but I don't think it can. I think what the EM can hope to do for a large number of countries is to preach a very positive message about the benefits of being part of Europe. And the country needs a bit of positivity at the moment. So I think that would begin to bring the country together. So talk about the good things, talk about what we enjoyed from being a part of the EU. And I do think that those of us who were campaigning hard to avoid Brexit and then for a referendum on the terms failed to make the positive case for membership of the EU. And if we can make people in the UK feel European again, that would be a united front to have. Of course, there would be some people who couldn't buy into that, but they are going to be a minority. And increasingly, and it sounds tough to say it, but as the demographic changes and people who were not able to benefit from being in the EU, or hardly because they're still young, are growing up, they're going to want to be back in the EU. We know that young people are much more in favour than the older generation. As that demographic changes, I think it will be possible to have a much more unified country. So I am very hopeful that the youth of today is a much more kind, caring, sensible body on the whole, like Britain's used to be generally. But just before I came on here, I was in Parliament Square, where there's a demonstration against the asylum seekers bill, the most horrendous piece of legislation. Ghastly weather, it was cold, it was wet, and there were a lot of young people who were prepared to go out in that weather and demonstrate. And that's excellent, and it is going to be part of unifying the country. And I think a change of government will help as well. But you'll never get everybody to be singing from the same hymn sheet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Now, the next question, we can come back to some of your other questions, Sandra, later, if we I know there was more than one, but I thought for the moment, go to David Cairns, who asked me to read the next question. The role of a chairperson is usually understood to be to ensure the voices and opinions of all those present are heard, that meetings are conducted in an orderly fashion, that decisions are reached fairly. The job description for the position of chair emphasizes leadership, however. Is there a tension here, and how would you propose Patience to manage it? It's the eternal dilemma between being the chair and being the CEO. Well, although we have a CEO, but I think I understand what that difference is. Is it management, or is it just chairing and reconciling what is going to be very diverse viewpoints?
There's a very extensive job description, and it struck me as a very good job description too. I've been in various organizations where the chairman and chief executive worked incredibly well together. And where you have that relationship, it's certainly worth more than 1 and 1. Where you have a chairman and chief executive who don't have a constructive working relationship, it's disastrous. So I think that's my starting point. The chairman and the chief executive have to have a strong relationship and an effective modus vivendi. And your question is absolutely right up to a point. The chairman's role is to help the chief executive develop strategy. The chairman's role is not implementation. That's the chief executive's role. That doesn't mean that the chairman can't have an outside-facing role, and indeed increasingly in business, that is the case, where I've seen it described as the chairman being the chief advocate for the company, while the chief executive has to get on with running the show. And I think there would be chance for the chairman and chief exec of the EM to work out exactly how they wanted to do the external advocacy role. Well, there would be no doubt at all that the internal management function was entirely down to the chief exec. But being chief exec can be an incredibly lonely place. And having a chairman who is supportive, can offer advice when wanted, and also be a critical friend when required, is essential. And I think experience of business is actually very helpful to anyone coming into the chairman role, whether in a company or in an organization like the EM. And as I say, I've been in plenty of organizations where I've experienced that. I chair an organization at the moment, the Association of Leading Visitor Attractions. And yes, my role is very much to listen to the members. You've got to keep your members happy. And they know what's going on the ground too. So it's very useful to hear from them. But you also have to be able to bring something to the party. So what I bring to the ALVA members, or try to, is some intelligence from the political front, and to listen to them and feed that back to the politicians. And there are some things that they're desperate about at the moment. One of them is the loss of tax-free shopping in the UK, for instance, which is not just hitting the retailers, it's hitting tourism generally. So it's clobbering the major visitor attractions, which are members of ALVA. So I'm used to listening to my members, but I also have a chief exec who is extraordinarily effective, and I would never dream of getting in his way. But he and I talk, and I offer him my thoughts and advice, and he comes to me when he wants advice. And I think that that's a good working relationship. I've been in companies where I've seen the chairman and chief exec be absolutely as one. And I've seen companies where that doesn't work, and that really is not the recipe. So it is essential that the chairman and the chief exec can establish a good working relationship from the start. And of course, much as it's really sad to see Anna Bird departing, there is a marvelous opportunity now for a new chief exec, sorry, a new chairman to be involved in the appointment of the chief exec. And that's a beneficial starting point for both parties, actually, I think.
Thank you, Patience. The next question from Lizzie Price. I don't know if Lizzie wants to ask directly, or I can read it out, but it doesn't say on my feed that it's to be read out, so the person may wish to ask it herself.
I'm happy to ask it. It's because it's quite rambling. Basically, I wonder how the European movement can reach out, appeal to young people more. I particularly, in my circumstance, I have student sons who have wanted to study abroad, and the paperwork has been excessive and difficult to manage post-Brexit. And I've also noticed, having volunteered in schools with modern languages, how difficult it is to take schools to do schools exchanges. And I just wondered if you think there's a role for EM here to step in and try and lobby to facilitate something better, because I think this is a really negative step for our young people. Thank you.
I think there are two parts to your question, and thank you for both of them, Lizzie. The second part, which I'll deal with first, if I may, is that absolutely the EM should be lobbying very hard to get school visits going and to indeed get back into Amadeus. And it's really sad that school trips with Europe seem to have ground to a halt. It's difficult for trips coming from Europe, the EU, into the UK, because they used to come as a class, and they used to come with some of them having identity cards or identity other than a passport. It's now impossible for them to come without a full passport. And so if you're a teacher and your class has in it even one person without a passport, it's easier to take your class on a trip to a different country where you don't need passport. And that's happening now. And that's really impacting on exchanges. And I'm an ardent believer in the value of school exchanges and building relationships with other Europeans at a very early age and nurturing those relationships. In the end, what we're talking about with the EU is people and relationships. And the younger they start, the better. So I think we should certainly be lobbying hard to find a way of easing that. And it should be possible for children with identity other than passports to come to the UK. They're not going to be terrorists. We need to be a bit more flexible on that. And then if you go to an older age group, Amadeus was a fabulous scheme. So many people, Erasmus, benefited from Erasmus. And we need to get that back on the agenda very fast. The scheme that we've brought in is just no replacement at all. It may be, well, it is more global, but that's not the point. It doesn't offer people the same opportunities or the same finance. It's not a substitute. So we need to get back into Erasmus. And I think that the mood on that is changing, and the sooner we can do it, the better. And the EM should be a loud voice on that. And of course, the beneficiaries would be young people. How do we get more young people involved, though, which was the first part of your question? Well, there is, of course, the Young European Movement, but it's nowhere large enough. It's financed largely, well, in part by the EM. And in theory, young members of the EM are members of the Young European Movement. But I don't think nearly enough is known. It's the same problem in a way, a lack of profile, and more needs to be done. And the EM could do far more to promote the Young European Movement, and should do much more. But the Young European Movement could do more if it had the resources. And one of the things it could be doing is a lot more social events. I went to an excellent Young European Movement do where they were talking about Erasmus, and they managed to get the German ambassador to come along and speak. He spoke very effectively, and there should have been a bigger audience for it. Most of the people who were there were actually European rather than Brits. And so these were people who belonged to the equivalent of the Young European movement in their home countries and had tapped into the Young European movement when they arrived here. So it needs to have a much bigger presence. And one of the ways to grow that immediately is through the universities. When we were campaigning for a referendum on the terms of Brexit, the People's Vote campaign, one of the most effective mechanisms was the group that worked with universities and signed people up that way. So I think that there's huge scope, but people need to know about it before they can join it.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add to that, you know, one of my sons is just finishing his degree, but some of his friends who weren't studying languages also went abroad. And what they noticed was in Europe, so many more people traveled to study. It was Erasmus was a much more taken up, and we, you know, and it's a real shame that our students don't travel in the way that other European countries don't realize what they can do. So I think there is a massive role for a European movement to step into. Big hole there. I'd love to see that filled. Thank you.
Quite right. Well, maybe you'd be active in a campaign when we launch it, Lizzie.
I'd be delighted. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the next question I have on my list is Jane Thomas. Jane? Was that for me to ask? Well, I think it's Jane.
No, I'm here.
You're here. Hello. Good evening. Sorry, I can't see everybody up on the screen because there are too many of you. So
nice position to be in.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dominic. Patience, I'm really interested in your parliamentary sort of experience and what you can bring to it. Having sort of myself worked on the various aspects of the EU withdrawal bill, I know sort of some of the legislative niceties are sometimes not things that infuse people, but we really need a bigger presence in Parliament. We really need to have some traction on our parliamentarians. And even if it's not going to be this side of the general election, I think actually the presence and what you can bring to bear as soon as hopefully we get rid of this government and bring in one that's a bit more sensible, I think there's going to be huge opportunities. So I'm interested to hear what your sort of, how you think the landscape's going to lie and where you can bring influence and what it's going to look like.
Well, I think Dominic knows that actually what goes on behind the scenes in Parliament is often far more interesting than what goes on in front. And certainly in the run up to 2019 and then beyond, there was a very strong cross-party operation in Parliament to try and argue for Europe and EU membership. And Dominic and I would meet regularly there. He was in charge and very effective chairing our meetings, but they were cross-party. And there are other issues where those sort of cross-party initiatives can work very well. It's much easier actually in the Lords, where because of having the crossbench, it's very easy to rally good numbers of people to operate cross-party. But there are quite a lot of issues on which that happens now. And I think that, for instance, on something like the extraordinary retained EU law bill, the Lords has real impact. There have been some absolutely condemning speeches in the Lords from the law lords, particularly those like Igor Judge, former head of the Supreme Court, who have taken apart this atrocious piece of legislation. And in the end, the Lords will block this bill. I have no doubt that we will, and that will be agreed behind the scenes, not cross-party, because the Conservatives won't be involved in that discussion. but Labour, the Lib Dems and the crossbench will be involved because it has to be a concerted effort to do it. So there is scope, and on specific issues, it happens. And as you would know, Jane, when it comes to amending legislation, it is much more effective to put an amendment if it has cross-party support. And I'm used to doing that. And my name was on some amendments to the Financial Services Bill with another crossbencher, a Labour person and a Lib Dem. And that sort of cooperation happens in the Lords a lot. And I think there will be far more scope for it under, as you say, perhaps a more moderate, sensible government than the one we currently have. Let's hope. Because there are going to be so many things that need to be put right quite quickly.
Thank you. There was a question from Sarah Murphy, but you've answered it as we went along, which was on the basis of whether your likelihood that the Lords could stop or amend the EU retained law bill. And by the sounds of it, that is exactly what's going to happen. So I don't think we need to go on to that one. And that's my impression, I must say, too. I think it's one of those rare occasions where the bill is so monstrous, even when viewed. I've never understood why the government's doing it, except as a sort of token gesture to some ERG maniacs, because it's a crazy piece of legislation, even viewed from the government's own interest.
Well, it's almost worse than that, I think, Dominic. It's very hard to escape the view that the only reason they're pressing ahead with such a disastrous piece of legislation is that were it to go through, it would make getting back into the single market and the EU very much harder. Yes, so I think it's as cynical as that.
Next question from Peter Dawson. Peter Dawson.
Yeah. Hi, Dominic.
Hello, Peter. How are you? How very
I'm
nice.
very well indeed. Being a Conservative that came up to help you in Beaconsfield.
You did indeed. I remember it very well. Good evening.
And a fellow member of the European Forum.
I'm sorry we never had the party because of COVID, which was a great disappointment because I was planning to have a big hoolie afterwards, and it was planned for the 28th of March 2020, and of course it all got cancelled.
Yeah. Anyway, my question really more as a member of the European movement as well as the Conservative European Forum, is there a danger that the EM is seen as a bit too London-centric? Patience, some of your supporters obviously are senior business, senior cultural people. It sounds London. So how is the London-centric aspect? And my membership is based in Wandsworth, so I'm I've been in London for decades from Lancashire, but I just worry about how you'll get the similar people on board in the regions and use them.
Well, thank you for your question. And I understand the dangers that you're highlighting. I'm based in London and I'm in Parliament, and you're right, a lot of the endorsers come from a broad spectrum on one criteria, but particularly narrow if one's looking at it a different way. And how would I change that? Well, I don't think you can change that, but I do think it's very easy to make an effort to get round the regions, which I would do, to make sure that one is listening to the regions. And I'm lucky enough to have on my campaign team quite a broad representation of the country, from Scotland, Wales, and down to Kent. So it's not entirely London. I was a very active campaigner with the Hythe Remainers in Kent, and actually got Andrew Adonis to come down and talk to us. We filled the Hythe Sports Hall which was a great evening. He was a very, very good speaker. And Chris was there draped in a flag. So I think I can't deny what I am, but I can certainly say that I embrace all parties, all regions, all types. Diversity is all. And if this organization is to succeed, it needs to be totally diverse in every way. And I'd like to think that I'm very much capable of embracing diversity. I've always wanted it in organizations I've been involved with, and the EM would be no different. And I'm absolutely clear that it's people on the ground that make the difference in the end. And we need them right across the country in huge numbers. Are you convinced, Peter?
Yes, I know that the spirit is there, and I know there's some brilliant organisations outside London in the European movement. I suppose it's trying to get equivalent business leaders, equivalent academic leaders, and equivalent cultural leaders from the Northeast, the Northwest, from Scotland, also involved, as much as a focus some of the London national leaders.
I think absolutely right. And if you were on the call fairly early on, one of the things I was talking about was the importance of having spokespeople locally who could deal with the local media. And I think in all the areas that you just talked about, that would be really important. So, the local media needs to be able to talk to somebody who's at the local hospital, somebody who's at the local university. And there are plenty of pro-Europeans in those organizations throughout the country, but we have to find them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Another question from Sarah Murphy. She says I can ask. And this touches on, we've touched on Erasmus, but the potential for the European movement to try to make life easier for our artists and musicians in terms of touring and taking their instruments with them without the need for burdensome and costly customs declarations. Do you think, Patience, that's a campaign that the EM might be able to mount? Have always struck me as being one of the silliest of the consequences of well, there are so many bad consequences of Brexit, but this ought to be a rectifiable one.
It is a rectifiable one, and it crops up regularly in the Lords, where a lot of people feel passionately about the arts and music. And the government so far has not been prepared to commit, but I think the rhetoric is getting to such a level that they will have to listen. And the campaign is definitely one that the EM should be upfront with. Why damage your creative industries when they are so vital to this country? And what's known as the cabotage, the costs of taking instruments abroad now is prohibitive for so many small bands, touring orchestras. It's crazy. And the EM should make it absolutely one of its first new campaigns, because like you, I think it's winnable. It could also be fantastic in increasing the profile of the EM, because think of all the musicians that one could sign up under the EM banner. I think it's a great opportunity, actually. And if everybody on this call could think of the person in the music industry that they would like to be involved, we could try and approach some of the best names in the industry and have a really strong campaign. And that could be classical music as well as pop, right across the board. And of course, it's not just musicians. Photographers are really being hit by this too. It's a crazy situation, but it is, as you say, Dominic, very easy to remedy.
Thank you. Now we have a couple more questions and more questions coming in. Sharon Leclerc Spooner. Sharon, do you wish to ask your question directly? I think you probably do.
Yes.
Hello, good evening.
Hi, good evening. So my name is Sharon Leclerc-Spooner. I'm chair of Pro Europa in Brussels, known on LBC as Sharon from Brussels. My question really is how you see the European movement rebuilding relations with the EU and the role that organisations outside of the UK who are affiliated to the European movement can play to help with that.
Hello, Sharon from Brussels, and thank you for your question. It's a very good one. And I think that one of the great advantages for anybody coming into the European movement as chairman is Molly Scott-Cato, who has done a fantastic job holding things together during the last year and is raring to be the person who goes around Europe building bridges and relationships. And I think that much as an incoming chair might want to do that, it's probably more important in the first few months that the incoming chair concentrates on the UK. And to have Molly ready and willing to go and do that seems to me really important, because those relationships are crucial. At the moment, I think there are some things that could be done very quickly, and really getting to know the EU ambassador, and now we're allowed to treat him as an ambassador to the UK, is going to be a useful first step. I've got pretty good relationships with the Irish because I just happen to know the Irish embassy and the Irish ambassador who arrived at the time that it was unfortunate for him. Martin Fraser came just as the Queen was making her exit, so his arrival was somewhat fraught. But he's settled in really well. I've been to lunches there a couple of times. And so Ireland isn't an issue. We've got good relationships there. One of my endorsers is the director of the British Irish Chamber of Commerce, with whom I've done quite a bit of work in the past. But I think that abroad, in Europe, in the EU, we need to be building much stronger relationships with all sorts of groups. And I think if Molly can pave the way, we can do all sorts of things. We can invite people over. The EM, what I'd like to see the EM doing again too, is encouraging really serious town twinning. You know, there are too many towns that put up signs saying they're linked with X, Y, Z, and it amounts to very little. But we could have a campaign to encourage town twinning between the UK and the EU and build relationships that way. As I said earlier, rejoining the EU and our relationship with the EU is all about personal relationships. And if you can build those, it's a really good start. And town twinning would get local councils and local mayors into much stronger relationships with their European equivalents. That's worth doing. So there are lots of options. It takes time and it takes people and effort. But I think that my impression is that the people in the EU are still very happy to build relationships with those they deem to be on their side. And the EM is remarkably well placed to do that. And maybe in Brussels, you could help.
Yep, thank you.
Unmute myself.
That's certainly we can.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Now we've got, I think, looking at the way the clock is going, we've got time for probably a couple more questions. Peter from WD4E, which I assume is West Dorset for EU.
No, no, Dominic, it's Warwick District for Europe.
West. Welcome, and you have a question to ask of Patience.
Yeah, so Dominic was so committed to the campaign that he even came up to Leamington Spa on his birthday to speak to us. Yeah. My question for Patience is, how much time do you have to dedicate to the role of chair of European Movement?
As much as it takes. It would be my first priority. I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I would want to do it. So I'd be very happy to come and visit you, whether it was my birthday or not. And I think that, I mean, the joy of the Lords is that I can do as much or as little as I want and as I deem sensible. So if it's a bill that's really important for the EM, I would want to be there. But the EM has to be the first priority. And that's the reason why I'm going through this election process, is because I deem it to be an incredibly important thing to do. I was really, really upset when we lost the campaign for a people's vote. And I've never quite got over that. And I see this as an opportunity to, a last chance, really, to try and retrieve the European dream that I want for my children and their children. So I give it what it needs.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that brings us to what may be the final question. I think there's one from Richard Crump. Richard?
Hi, Dominic. Yes, thanks. Yeah, my question simply is, why would you be a better chair than the other two candidates?
Good question. I think the experience I've had in business is actually a positive, and it's a positive that the others really haven't had. They've got all sorts of things to recommend them, and I certainly won't get involved in any sort of negative campaigning, but they haven't had the business experience I've had, and neither have they had the media experience I've had. As I say, mine's been an unplanned career, really. When I got involved in journalism, I didn't expect to be an editor, but I got to be an editor. I had never expected to be on the board of Fiat Chrysler, but I got to be on the board of Fiat Chrysler. My children still think it's a nonsense that I should ever have been on the board of an automobile company, given that it took me 11 goes to pass my driving test. But I think they're quite wrong. I took the driving test very, very seriously. I have parliamentary experience, both as somebody who used to write about Parliament and somebody who is now in Parliament. Tom, of course, has been in Parliament for 22 years. So I can't say that I've got anything that he hasn't, but I do think that the combination of business, media, politics, and the other thing I have is time. You know, the last question was very pointed. How much time would you give it? Well, I'm at that stage in my life where I am free to do with my time what I want to do with my time. It's a privileged position to be in, but it comes with having worked for a long time and come out the other end.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And can I just add a question to that, Patience, which actually came from, it was one of Sandra Kaduri's. So I apologize, Sandra, for hijacking your question, but came earlier and never got put, but it was quite an interesting one. She asked this: why couldn't we have a triumvirate at the head of the EM with all three candidates as leaders in different ways? Last time it would have been so good to have Dominic as head of political engagement, Andrew as the campaign figurehead, and Peter Kellner as the strategist, pollster, manager. Isn't it impossible to expect one person to have every skill set? And indeed, I don't think anybody is expecting you to have every skill set. And I just wondered, as a sort of end roundup, if you'd like to say anything about how you would like to try or would want to try to make use of others. I know that that first of all means poking them a bit with a stick and saying, please come and do something. But how you would, not necessarily the other candidates, but just generally try to encourage people to support you?
Okay, I think that you're absolutely right that not everybody can have all the skills necessary. But I do believe that a chairman should have certain skills and know how to harness others who can bring skills to the party. And having a strategy that makes the most of everybody's talents is obviously really important, particularly in an organisation like the EM, which doesn't have unlimited resources. So being able to tap into people who will give their time and their expertise and their energy is very important. Of course, you need paid staff, and ideally relatively well-paid staff, because you want the best. But there is a limit to what can be done that way. And I would certainly want to have an advisory board of people who could bring all sorts of different skills and knowledge to the EM. That would not impinge on the governance structure at all, but it would be about bringing new thinking, potentially, advice and ideas to play. And you can never have too many ideas. And then it would be up to the chief exec in conversation with the chairman to decide exactly which of those ideas were worth trying to put into action, and if so, how to do it. But I think harnessing various talents is key. I think that there have to be individuals in specific roles. I'm a great believer in teams. I've always worked with teams. It's, in my view, the only way of working, but I'm not in any doubt that need leaders. And without a degree of leadership, things simply don't happen. So triumvirates are wonderful in theory, but I don't think they work in practice. You need to have some. Go on, Dominic.
No, I was just going to say, no, don't let me interrupt you. There was there's one final half question which links into this, and I was just going to ask it, but when you finished saying what you wanted to say, I didn't mean to interrupt you at all. My apologies.
No,
on triumvirate.
Moment.
Well, what I was...
No, all I was going to say about they don't work.
Yeah. There's a question from Dr. Charles Smith, which I think is quite interesting and dovetails with this, saying, when I was an economics lecturer at Swansea Business School in the 1990s and 2000s, the then director of EM, Maurice Brodie, the professor of town planning, took a lead in organising a local EM branch to make contact with university students, help them organise visiting speakers, sponsor them to attend conferences. Would it be a good idea to set up a network, a helpful academic located in as many university towns as possible? And that dovetails a bit with putting people to work to start building those networks.
I think it's a brilliant idea. Put that way, why wouldn't one do it? I think if the EM can have its tentacles out in as many directions as possible, it can only be a positive. And getting academics on board, getting them to help their students get on board, wonderful idea. Yes, please.
Good. Well, that's a good note on which to end. And could I just firstly thank you, Patience, because it's a long session and it's been most enjoyable. And then thank all those who have participated and attended, without which it wouldn't have been an enjoyable session at all. In fact, there would have been no session. So it's always rather useful when people come along and participate in this type of discussion. I don't know, Patience, if there's anything you wanted to say as a final au revoir before we bring this to an end. Otherwise, I will be passing back to Chris and simply repeat my thanks to all those who have come this evening.
Yes, what I'd really like to say, Dominic, is a huge thank you to you and to those who organised that this evening, and to all of you who came along. I've really enjoyed it, and I think it's been stimulating, and it's given me quite a lot to think about. What I'd also like to say, though, is please vote, and please encourage all your friends to vote if they're members of the EM, because even if you don't vote for me, I would rather that we saw a high poll. What we don't want to get to is a situation where a chair is elected and a majority of the electorate didn't go near their ballot paper. So try and encourage as many people as you know to please cast a vote. Of course, I'd like it to be for me, but I'd rather they vote. On which note, good night from me and thank you.
What a wonderful evening. Thank you both so very much. I think it's fantastic that you've both given of your time this evening, and I think for everyone here to share that time with you and to actually be able to listen to two very prominent people in politics and now back in the law profession as a KC, Dominic and Patience. You have the ability to more or less answer everything straight away without hesitation. You'd be very good on just a minute, I think. And it's been a wonderful occasion, and thank you both very, very much. Thank you also to everybody who attended. I could go on praising you, it's Patience, but I'll bring it gradually to a close. I'll just remind people, as to add on to what Patience has said, that you should all have had your ballot papers. If you have not, please write to elections@europeanmovement.co.uk. That is elections@europeanmovement.co.uk. Now then, if you want to hear more from Patience, we'll simply vote for her, and then you'll hear a lot from her. And if you want to hear more from Dominic, well, come along to our event in East Kent on the 30th of March, when he will be speaking in person. We're very privileged to have him down there. We have got a special guest who's on my screen right next to you, Dominic. That's Patience. So we're looking forward to that. And you've told me you are. That will be our next occasion. And with that, I will make sure that people, if you want to save the chat, now is your opportunity to do that. And on behalf of everybody, I wish you both a pleasant evening in Newsnight, Patience, and Dominic, I guess, with work perhaps, and for the rest of the week. I'm going to allow everybody to unmute. I think that should happen, and we say thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Patience.
you.
Thank you all. Thank you to all participants.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Night.
Bye. Thanks, Chris. Well done.
Thank you, Patience.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Dominic. Thank you, Sarah.
I saw the video.
Well done, Chris. See you tomorrow.
Yes, will do. Thank you very much. I just need to make sure.